into the inside of a car named after its engine, the F8 Tributo, or rather this is the F8 Spider. But still, it is named after Ferrari's V8 engine, which has, for the last 4 years, won the International Engine of the Year award, got named the greatest engine of the past 20 years. But first things first, this being the Spider, I'm just going to stop and put the roof up so that you can hear what I'm saying a little more clearly. So what is it then, the F8 Spider? Well, ostensibly it is the next generation car on from the 488, which continued from the 458. 488 arrived with turbochargers for the first time, which continued from the 458, which continued from the F430, and so on and so forth. It is the latest iteration of Ferrari's V8 mid-engine supercar. Now, typically, the structure underpinning that supercar would last for 2 generations, so 458 and 488, for example. However, in this case, it has continued for a 3rd generation, if you like. So if you want, you could conceive this car as a very heavy facelift of the 488. Now, the 488 finished with the Pista Special Edition, so slightly more hardcore. Not as hardcore as Scuderia or Speciale that came before it, but a more hardcore version of the 488. And many elements of that, as is Ferrari's way, carry over to this. Specifically, the engine. The Pista had all but a Ferrari Challenge Cup engine. So it's got much lighter internals, so it spins up much quicker, there's very little turbo lag, and for a 3.9 litre unit, it makes a faintly astonishing 710 brake horsepower, which is the same, coincidentally, or not, as McLaren's 720S. Now, the Pista engine has been carried over largely unchanged into the F8, which is terrific. There are some detailed changes, chief among which is the addition of 2 gas particulate filters, as dictated by modern emissions regulations. Now, in some cars, that can mute the exhaust note, and it can also limit the power. So Ferrari has done some trickery with the exhaust and with the electronics to mean that it still makes that 710 brake horsepower peak at 8,000 RPM, which is quite a lot for a turbocharged motor. And what we've always liked about the F8 488 Pista twin turbo unit is how responsive this turbocharged engine is. So not only does it rev to 8, which is high for a turbo, more significantly, so that's 4th gear with just a little over 2,500 RPM wound on. And the response, the pickup is really, really quick. Ferrari works incredibly hard to make those turbos have as little inertia as possible. And with a capacity of 3.9 litres, which is, you know, lusty enough, that means that while it's not as whip-crack responsive as an old 458 engine, and the best naturally aspirated engine, say in a Porsche 911 GT3, it is, for a turbo unit, terrific. Terrifically responsive. More responsive, I think, than a Porsche GT2 RS, more responsive than a McLaren 720S. And that gives it a significant advantage, I think, from, let's face it, the company who initially used to make an engine and chuck a car in for free. Now, the same is not true today. It hasn't been for quite some time. But I think Ferrari's offering in this segment, this mid-engine V8 segment, has become increasingly better over the past decade. Like, massively better, since the arrival of a new car company called McLaren Automotive. Obviously, McLaren made road cars before that, but this new phase of McLaren really put the wind up Ferrari, and it has really gone to great lengths to make this car spectacular ever since. So underneath it still uses a largely aluminium structure. Now, that differs from McLaren, which just uses a carbon fibre tub, and that's significant when we come to talking about the convertible, because when you take the roof off a Spider McLaren, you can barely tell the difference. The torsional rigidity, thanks to the stiffness of the shell with its high sills and everything else, you can barely tell. I don't think you can tell. I've driven McLarens, and only when somebody's gone, oh yeah, this is the Spider, has it occurred to me that the roof comes off. This F8, as with the 488, 458 before it, when you remove the roof, torsional rigidity does come down a bit. Now, with it closed like this, the retractable hardtop, that adds to the stiffness. I can't tell so much that it's a soft top, but when you do put that roof down, just notice a little bit of a shimmy between front and rear axles, as if the chassis is not quite as stiff as it would have been, and McLaren does not have to worry about that. However, when you make a car out of a carbon fibre tub and you put a lot of strength in the sills, like an aluminium tub with a lot of strength in the sills in Lotus Elise or Lotus Evora, pushes the passengers closer together. And also in the McLaren, they have a large centre console running down the middle, so it feels a more cramped environment. Although the driving position in a 720S is fantastic, the Ferrari has a rather more laid-back cabin with a bit more space between the passengers, or certainly as it feels, slightly easier to get in and out of with its conventional doors. For a car for two people to go touring in, I think it is a nicer proposition. It's also less complicated than some rivals in its drive modes. Basically, two for the dampers. There's one button that makes the dampers softer if you want to, and then it leaves them hard if you don't. And then it's got the little Manatino, which just changes, well, crikey, the list of things it changes is extraordinary, but they're all linked together. Effectively, it changes how hardcore the chassis response is when you are pushing it along. So eventually you can go to turn everything off if you want. You can just turn traction control off. You can have it a little bit of slip, you can have it a little bit less slip, but you can have it in wet mode, which is not very much slip at all. That's the short of it. It's a very simple way to do something ultimately very complicated. But for you as the user, happy days. You don't have to give it a second thought. And how does it drive the rest of the time? Well, that's when it absolutely flies, and it really gives back in a nice, honest way. It's got a very straightforward chassis proposition. There's lots of electronics involved, but the actual proposition is straightforward. Twin turbocharged V8, 7-speed dual clutch gearbox, limited slip differential at the back with electronic governing of it. But the fact that it is a limited slip differential means that as you turn into a corner, the diff is open because it's electronic. As you come out of a corner, the electronics start to stiffen it up, and you can just feel the car straightening its line, even at sensible road speeds like this. This is an approachable, playful car that you do not have to be right up at the top end of to get the best out of it. You can drive it at Mazda MX-5 speeds and get more than Mazda MX-5 rewards, and not all sports cars are capable of doing that. But I think what marks the mid-engined Ferrari out from all of its rivals is the fact that it doesn't take itself perhaps quite so seriously. It wants you to have a good time, and others may try a lot harder to go maybe that much quicker on a circuit, but how much does that matter? It's not the best car in every aspect. I think a McLaren 720S steers more nicely, probably rides a bit more smoothly. A 911 GT2 RS is a bit narrower and has terrific steering as well, probably nicer than this. And the Lamborghini Huracan has, of course, that wild V10 engine. But taken as a whole, because of how much fun it wants you to have and how accessible it makes its performance and entertainment, there's still no question for me. I mean, not all of my colleagues agree, but for me, this is still absolutely the best supercar you can buy.